Arran Gare, I want to invite you and welcome you to this webcast where we have a chance to feature you and your thought and your recent work on the philosophical foundations of ecological civilization. You were present at the International Conference on Ecological Civilization. Your work has been one of the central concepts in moving forward with an understanding of this notion and bringing it to global attention in China and across in the English-speaking world. I wonder if you could start the conversation by telling us a little bit about your career and how you came to write this recent book.
Okay, well, I began as an environmental philosopher. That was my first job in 1981, setting up a course on environmental philosophy. So from then on, that was the focus of all my work, tracing what was wrong and so on. But I came to it with a background in history and philosophy of science. So my focus was on how we're wrecking the global ecosystem, not the rights of animals or wilderness areas. And as I did the research, it became more and more horrifying. My first major book was Nihilism Incorporated, European Civilization and Environmental Destruction, looking at how European civilization had conquered the world and was now destroying the global ecosystem, two branches of it competing with each other with very similar orientations. The nihilism, basically, I think Western culture is nihilistic. It has no values, and so it's indifferent to the destruction that it's causing. It's indifferent to the fact that it killed about 150 million people in conquering the world. The second part was looking at the Soviet Union and trying to work out why it had promised but had failed, why Marxism hadn't replaced capitalism. What you really found was that you had two kinds of bureaucratic capitalism. The period after that's really what the Nazis were, a form of bureaucratic capitalism. So Nazism, Stalinism, and then really neoliberalism, the different forms of bureaucratic capitalism. And that's what was coming to the fore. And the proponents of that were continuing this process of disembedding markets and forcing people to conform to markets, now driven by transnational corporations. And they've been characterized by David Corton as a cancer in the global ecosystem. So it's created a new class, the global corporatocracy, who are the managers, enslaving effectively the rest of the population. Now, when people think of enslavement, they think of field slaves, but what you've really got is a large number of house slaves. The Romans characterized slavery as a position where you can be harmed by people on whom you're dependent. And that's really the position that neoliberals have created. They've eradicated people's economic security, also countries, nations being undermined by this. And you've got a co-optation of all the left-wing parties who embrace neoliberalism. So that's the situation we're facing. My third book was Postmodernism and the Environmental Crisis. And that was trying to work out what was going on with postmodernism. It turned out really that the humanities were destroying themselves. I hadn't properly understood that at the time. The transformation of my university made it very difficult for me then to write any more books until 20 years later. And that was again because the house slaves were in charge, trying to destroy the kind of education system required for people to be able to govern themselves. So you've got this coalition of bureaucracy and markets against democracy, and it's a real struggle, I think, to create democracy if we're going to effectively deal with the global ecological crisis. So the last book, the philosophical foundations of ecological civilization, is committed to that, providing the kind of education required for people to regain control of their destiny, which is essential.
Mm-hmm. What I'd like to do is to ask you to go through the major features of your work. I have four written out, and I'd like to ask you about each one briefly.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, see if we can draw the pieces together. So number one is critique, and there are many aspects of contemporary society or globalization that you criticize. You've just mentioned some to us. Intellectually, you have some criticisms that involve a kind of science, a kind of reduction, and then a kind of society built upon them. Could you just give us a minute or two to tell us about those criticisms that then fuel your positive moves?
Okay, well, what I came to realize was that the scientific revolution of the 17th century was a reaction to Renaissance thought, which wasn't entirely successful. It was an attempt to eliminate the democracy revived in northern Italy, particularly in Florence. And you had two strands dominating Western civilization then. One committed to total technological control of the world, the other really looking at the world as self-organizing and cultivating the kind of people required to govern themselves. So that was really the radical enlightenment. There's two kinds of enlightenment, one oriented towards total technological domination. The radical tradition has been really successful in advancing science, focusing on electricity, magnetism, light and so on, to oppose the Newtonian view of the world. So this, I think, is best developed in actually ecology. But what you get is governments realizing, I think, or people realizing who are in power, that the development of science was actually invalidating their legitimacy, their social Darwinism and so on. So they transformed the education system so that science is reduced to just a means to develop technology. They set about destroying the humanities and trivializing or supporting those people in the humanities who were undermining it, the deconstructive postmodernists. The people who should have been grappling with all this are the philosophers, and they'd transformed philosophy into this trivial set of academic parlor games, being ultra specialists instead of being the people who put everything in perspective. So the most important thing was to revive philosophy. So that's a major component of the book.
And that brings us nicely to the second theme, which is your retrieval of some major traditions. The one that is hardest for people to understand as they read the book is philosophical idealism. You're an expert in the German idealism, and you draw in particular from the British school of idealism. Can you put in simple terms what it means to take these as a foundation for thinking about ecological civilization?
Okay, well, the idealism really developed in reaction to scientific materialism in various forms, in Berkeley or whatever. I suppose the Neo-Kantians furthered that, and then the Hegelians. So they focused on mind, spirit, and so on, in opposition to scientific materialism. But in promoting idealism, they did it in a way that was successful to some extent, but it became more and more untenable in a way as scientific materialism developed, particularly the development of social Darwinism, or Darwinism and then social Darwinism. It seemed to explain all the things that the idealists had been talking about, justifying their position, but undermining the ideals that they'd been upholding. So idealism became weaker and weaker as an opposing position, and that's, I think, associated with the undermining of democracy. People don't really believe it's possible to be democratic because they don't really have any faith in the ideals that the idealists were defending. So to succeed, my work was really about developing or identifying a different tradition which was related to the idealists, but defending it on naturalistic foundations. And that means really challenging scientific materialism, showing that the world is such that it could have engendered humans with consciousness, the capacity to control their destiny and so on, free will. So that's the tradition that I'm trying to revive as part of the radical enlightenment.
Mm-hmm. There's something about how idealism understands the world in particular that is really transformative and maybe without parallel in modern thought. And I wonder if you could just briefly help us understand what is that new concept. I'll lead on to a follow-up question in a moment, but if people can see the different way that the human world way is conceived, that the world comes out not as shorn of its deeper qualities, but as including what would you say, life and value, and would you say sentience?
Oh, it has to include sentience, just to give a place to the evolution of sentience and the development of more and more complex forms of organisms with more and more complex forms of, as the Persians say, semiosis, the capacity to interpret signs and eventually developing humans with the capacity to reflect, developing much more complex forms of semiosis, involving a struggle for recognition. These are ideas that were developed by Fichte and Hegel and so on. The idea that you only become human through mutual recognition, and that fulfillment is only possible on that basis. And that's the real challenge to scientific materialism, because they treat people as just things to be manipulated. And then what they do is they undermine the capacity to get that affirmation, because you're treated as nothing but a thing by other people. They saw the development of understanding of the world not just as a means to control the world, but as this is part of the destiny of humanity, if it fulfills its vocation, that is to comprehend the world through us as human, as part of nature, where nature coming to understand itself. So that is a really important end to be concerned about. And then labour, well, you can see how that might be assimilated to treating the world as just an instrument. But you come to appreciate when you're actually working that you're working with a dynamic world, not a passive world. And you're actually participating in the creative process of becoming of the world. And that becomes particularly in focus when you look at ecology. We have to augment the ecosystems of which we're part, recognising their autonomous dynamics. Otherwise, we just destroy the conditions of our own existence.
In this concept, Arran, that you develop, process thought, Alfred North Whitehead in particular, play a very important role in your deriving an expanded understanding of naturalism, new naturalism, or a broad naturalism. And I wonder if you could say something about the way that Whitehead in particular inspired this new notion, and what it is to have a new naturalism available to us.
I think that it wasn't Whitehead who began it. It was really Schelling. I mean, perhaps Herder and Goethe before that. But this is one of the things that I've been trying to show, that there's a kind of tradition that Whitehead was further advancing, and he was developed the most complex metaphysics on this to advance this way of thinking. But seeing it as a broader tradition, people hadn't appreciated how Schelling broke away from the other idealists in upholding the importance of nature. So these people, as I say, are trying to naturalize the ideas of the idealists. Whitehead is most important because he started studying the work of Maxwell's equations. And Maxwell's, the development of field theory is really a development of that radical enlightenment, a new understanding of the world in opposition to Newtonian physics. But Whitehead was also a logician, symbolic logician, and a mathematician. So he was in a perfect position to be able to advance this. And then he influenced a number of other people, the biologists like Waddington, Needham, and so on. So they've made huge advances by through his achievements in questioning basic assumptions that people have been taking for granted, and showing that there were different ways of thinking. One of my main concepts is the notion of triad, self-stabilizing paths, which fits in with Taoism, actually. But this derived from Whitehead's notion of concrescence. So Whitehead is somebody who is an incredibly creative thinker. He's often very difficult to understand because he's trying to incorporate so many different facets of this revolution. But once you understand how they all fit together, you can see that this is the path that philosophy should have taken, through people like Whitehead, perhaps also Peirce, Bergson, and so on. They were affecting a major revolution in thought that has influenced science, but it's been subordinated partly, because of the analytic philosophers, effectively, the logical positivists, preventing the full implications of those ideas being appreciated.
Mm-hmm. From this broad naturalism or new naturalism, you move to a rich, expanded idea of ecological civilization. I wonder if you could talk in particular about how you understand that term, which after all is the name of this website and our organization.
Well, there are two terms there. Civilization is interesting because I think that it really reflected the ideas of the Renaissance thinkers, that societies tend to go in cycles. They move from barbarism, where you have virtues of courage and commitment to your community and so on, but in difference to the suffering of outsiders, you treat everyone else as just instruments to be, people to be subjugated. Then you develop civilization, where you extend that concern for others within your community to the broader community, ultimately to humanity, then beyond that. Well, with ecology, you're really talking about us as being part of nature and extending that commitment to others, to the rest of nature, to ecosystems of which we're part. And so it's the full development of civilization, but it's the full development not just of a particular civilization, it's the process by which humanity is creating a global civilization, which is absolutely essential to overcome this struggle between people, which is leading to arms races and immense amount of environmental destruction. If you look at the failures of civilizations in the past, they're usually associated with arms races, people fighting for domination, exploiting their environment more and more brutally, and the whole thing collapses. The other side of it is decadence, because I think that this is something we have to confront, that the affluent in the West are basically decadent. That's one of the reasons why they're not dealing with this crisis. They're just passively accepting everything, not questioning anything. Just
one of the criticisms we receive most often is that the idea that modernity could end. I mean, it's the basis of everything we've known for over 400 years. And to say, well, one civilization gives rise to another, for a lot of people, that's almost incomprehensible. How could the basis of our existence, the framework that we now all depend on, just suddenly pass away? How do you respond to criticisms like that?
Well, it's identifying this radical enlightenment, because it's not just something totally new. It's a development of the best parts of Western civilization. People like Herder, for instance, talked about cultures in the plural, recognizing that every society has got its own culture and should be appreciated as such. And those ideas have been developed and underlie the United Nations. You can see that trajectory, the development of global institutions committed to global justice there, but being blocked by this moderate enlightenment, which is really there to prevent these ideas reaching fruition. So I don't think that it's a matter of just erasing what we had in the past. It's recognizing that our commitment to democracy is antithetical to the moderate enlightenment, who wanted to get rid of democracy, and saying we should take that seriously and extend it to industrial democracy and so on, and create a world of communities, upholding the capacity of everyone to govern themselves.
Mm-hmm. As we come toward the end of this interview, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the practical implications of your work. People often say civilizational change. I don't know. How do I get started? What do I do tomorrow? I'd like to be a part of the change that you describe, but I don't know where to dig in, what to propose. Can you talk to us a little bit about that concrete implication?
Well, I think one of the most important things is actually to have that vision of the future. This is sort of utopia that wants to be realized, to inspire people, but to see how the work in all sorts of areas can be contributing to this. So, as Arnie Ness said, the front on which you're fighting is almost infinite. If you're in any institutions, you're engaged in a kind of war. In universities, for instance, you're fighting against the transformation of universities into business corporations, trying to uphold the Humboldtian notion of the university, which is really what's required for the modern civilization. You can talk about people opting out and forming small communities, which is fine, providing they see that as part of a broader project. As far as nations are concerned, they're struggling against transnational corporations and to regain control of their own destinies. That itself is a major struggle. It involves attacking all these ideas of neoliberal economics, the idea that everything should be deregulated, you should have free flow of capital, get rid of all tariff barriers and so on. You've got to recreate national economies so that people can control their economies, so you can re-embed the economies in the community democratically organised and reassert democracy. So just about wherever you look, whatever institution you're part of, whatever walk of life you're participating in, there's a struggle going on between two different trends. One towards reducing everything to just instruments for self-satisfaction, with ultimately no real belief in anything, nihilism, sort of death drive. The other side, an affirmation of life and all that's associated with that. So I write on a whole range of things, the development of architecture and town planning. Christopher Alexander's work should be upheld, committed to creating a beautiful built-up environment that fosters community rather than treating people as I say, just consumers or whatever.
Great. So as a final question, we wanted to ask this. Here in Claremont, working with John Cobb, EcoCiv has just launched what we're calling a global network for ecological civilization. And it's based on many of the premises and arguments that you've described. It includes a research center in Potsdam near Berlin, the Claremont work, your work, and the Chinese movement toward ecological civilization. Do you think that it's possible to use this notion of ecological civilization as a basis for work that connects visionary, even revolutionary people around the world to begin to take concrete steps toward this, civilizational change?
Yeah, I think it can.
Is there enough of a basis that we can talk about a global network?
I think there is, yeah. I mean, just about everything that you look at around the world, all oppression is somehow associated with exploiting the environment and environmental destruction. So it's what's required to bring all these people fighting against injustice together to see, the common cause of that problem and the common goal. So in the past, people believed in socialism or communism, and they've lost their credibility, I think, because they were mixed up. They had that commitment to democracy mixed up with that bureaucratization. This is a way of freeing that radical vision of the future from that commitment to just bureaucratization, to real liberty. You can sum it up, in terms of the American Revolution: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, providing you interpret them the right way, as I've pointed out in my conclusion. And the notion of ecological civilization, the term I think was coined in Russia by Ivan Frolov, and then taken up in China, so it's clearly got a strong foothold there. But I think that all the movements around the world that are fighting against oppression will be much more successful if they can align themselves with this idea.
Professor Arran Gare, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today, and I look forward to working with you toward a global network for ecological civilization.
Oh, thank you.